My name's Joyce and I was born in 1937, June the 20th, and just 2 years before war started. I was born in Grimsby, a non-stop maternity home, and I lived in Lambert Road near the People's Park. My mum was a housewife and a mother, as most were in those days, and my father was a captain in the Merchant Navy. His job was to ferry the food that the Liberty boats brought over from America, and they brought it to Hull, and then they distributed it all over the country, and the local boats took all the rations with food and all the things that were needed that we couldn't get, and they distributed around England. They were bringing stuff like sugar and tinned fruit and tinned meat, not fresh food of course, but most of the things were food that we needed because we couldn't get hold of food and it was all rationed. We were all supplied with a ration book, and it was a book which consisted of coupons, and each family were given coupons to buy food for the amount of people that were living in the house. And we were rather lucky because my father was in the Merchant Navy and got extra rations. I do remember the Canadians sending over to the school children cocoa powder, which we were supposed to make into a drink for nourishment, but we took a container to school to collect it, but unfortunately we all ate it before we got home. I remember being in bed at night and all of a sudden being shook to get up out of bed, and in the middle of the night, and I remember going downstairs and sitting on a chair and with a counterpane wrapped around me, shaking and not knowing whether it was fear or I was cold. And in our garden my father had dug us an air raid shelter, which was a huge hole in the ground, and it had protective corrugated sheeting and then all the soil put back on it, but it was literally a hole in the ground where there was permanent water in the bottom, and we had 2 wooden bunks in there and a paraffin stove, which on hindsight was quite dangerous. And we had to sit in there with a torch, and you would sit and you would hear the planes go over and you'd hear the odd boom where something had been dropped. And even only being young, you knew what was happening was serious, and you had to stay down there until the air raid siren went, the all clear. And once that went, you'd get up and go back into bed, but by then you were so cold and fed up that if you managed to get back to sleep you were lucky. But at the same time you still got up and went to work and went to school the next day. And then when we were at school we had to carry what a gas mask. If there was any gas threats, you would put it on, and it's like a ventilator thing, but we always had to carry that to school. And I remember at the time at school, if the air raid siren went, then you had to all leave your class and go and sit in the air raid shelter until the raid had finished, but that was very rare in daytime. But you can't imagine what our parents must have felt, knowing that we were somewhere in a shelter and not knowing whether a bomb would be dropped on you or not. But it was just one of those things that everybody lived with. We'd go to school and they'd say that so and so wasn't there because either they'd been bombed, or maybe their dad had got killed in the war, and so they'd had notification, so of course they didn't come to school, and that was very sad. I remember walking around Grimsby after the air raids, and you'd see certain buildings that had been bombed, and I remember the St James Church had been hit, and going and seeing part of it just rubble, and then seeing your favourite toy shop absolutely flattened to the ground, which was really bad. But generally it was something that you lived with, and it was part of life. And looking back, I think adults during the war, I think, really did fantastic. I was 8-year-old when World War II finished, and that was fantastic because we had a street party. Everyone came out to celebrate. We had flags and bunting up in the street. People brought tables and chairs out, and all the parents and the people all made sandwiches and cakes and jelly. One of my relatives, my mother's nephew, was in the Australian Air Force, and he was serving over here and was in, I think, Binbrook, and he was a pilot. We had lost touch with the family we had in Australia. He came to visit us, and so we got to know them again, and through that my parents decided to emigrate to Australia after the war, and we were sponsored by family, and my father was provided with a job. So in 1947 we got on a train at Grimsby station with all our belongings and went down to Tilbury and got on this huge steamer, which was actually a troop ship. So it wasn't very luxurious. When we arrived there, it was like unbelievable. There was so much fruit and food, and you just couldn't believe what difference it was. And it was hot as well, which is good. And then we left Perth and travelled around to Adelaide, and that was our destination. And the day that we arrived there, and we got off the boat, and we had family waiting for us in this real old-fashioned car. It was like the sort that you had in the American gangster films. And we were taken to my mother's sister's house, where we went to live until we got settled in. It cost us, for the children it was free, I think, but for the adults it cost £10. So we were known as the £10 Poms.